1989, and you were playing around with the internet for the first time. What are the similarities about like Bitcoin when you came across it and the internet at the very start? And like how far into Bitcoin's growth are we, do you think?
So very similar. So I'm seeing almost identical in terms of growth, adoption. You go through three phases. So you go through, in adoption of any new technology, you go through dismissal, ridicule, attack, accept, adopt. Okay. And we're somewhere between accept and adopt now on Bitcoin. But we've gone through the whole gamut of that with Bitcoin. You have to understand in the mid 90s, most people said the internet would never work, and the internet's only ever used by criminals and pornographers. And that genuinely, the internet had that. And I was deep in the internet. I was building websites, hosting websites, and everybody thought that the internet was only. Now, is that a familiar message with Bitcoin? You see that message of Bitcoin. There is a difference with the internet. The internet was a direct threat to middlemen, so it cuts out middle industries. Bitcoin cuts out governments. It's a different attack vector. So your enemies are different. With the internet, your enemies are all the knowledge industries that are trying to hold on to their domain, but they're not. They have power individually, but they don't have an awful lot of centralized power. They're not a massive attack vector. If you're trying to remove the control of currency from governments, that's a whole different attack vector. So Bitcoin has more powerful enemies, or had more powerful enemies than the internet. So in that respect, it's a harder job, and it's going through more attack vectors than the internet did. But it's incredible. The journey is incredibly similar. And in fact, I argue on almost a daily basis, where in internet terms are we? And the consensus is we're somewhere between 1992 and 1997. In terms of number of adoption, we're at 1997. So there were about 300 million internet users in 1997. We're about that in terms of wallet addresses. So in pure numbers, similar. I would argue we're much earlier in Bitcoin because the sentiment is there. We're still, so I tend to argue earlier, sort of 1994, something like that. But you can't draw exact parallels. So we're somewhere in the 90s in terms of Bitcoin adoption when you compare it to internet adoption. And bearing in mind broadband, the sort of ubiquitous, always on internet for a home user, didn't start happening until 2000, 2001. So we're still on dial-up modem for Bitcoin. If you put it, yeah. And I guess the analogy is, my phone, I've got native wallets on here. When everybody's got a native Bitcoin wallet on their phone, we're probably going to hit the equivalent of broadband adoption. I think we're probably 5 years away from Bitcoin, the currency, ubiquitous currency. And I think why it hasn't taken off as a currency, apart from the attack, is it's going up, but it's highly volatile, and you don't want a volatile currency. So I think it has to sort of reach parity with gold, and then potentially M1, M2 money supply. So it probably has to close to 100x to where we are now before it reaches its sort of full adoption and becomes a relatively stable currency. At which time people will be able to adopt it, because they won't be taking bets on the volatility of their currency. No, volatile currency is a bad thing. Volatile asset is a brilliant thing. Volatility is fantastic for assets because you can buy the dip, but you don't want your spending power to be cut in half within a day. So we're probably 5 years away from Bitcoin, the currency, as a generally adopted currency. So the idea of tether over Bitcoin is interesting in terms of and it's a little bit like a hybrid car. If you're going from petrol to electric, you may want a hybrid car first of all before you go full electric. So sort of tether over Bitcoin is kind of like the hybrid car is today before you go full electric. Kind of how I see it.
Cool. In some ways, like we're on the fringes of the internet talking about these things still. It's very true at the start of this conversation when we spoke about normie friends or people in your close community don't necessarily understand Bitcoin. And so here we are on video calls, halfway around the world to have discussions or debates or conversations with people that seem to adopt things faster. So to me, when it comes to how early are we, I think you're right. We're very much still like in the early 90s in terms of the average Sunday lunch table is not talking about Bitcoin in a serious way yet. But it will eventually. And it seems to me the more I learn, the more inevitable it is.